the Action Startup Mastermind series. Today I'm sitting down with the general partner of Verdexus, Randall Howard. Thank you for joining us today, Randall.
Thanks, Nick. Very much enjoy being here.
Can you tell us a little more about yourself for people who are unfamiliar with you?
All right. Well, thanks, Nick. I have quite a diverse background. I started out in, and I'll admit it freely, I'm a geek. I pure math, a computer science background, worked in a research group at University of Waterloo, which was developing a lot of the standards around distributed computing and networks that we today take as commodities, but it's really the backbone of today's digital economy. I had a great opportunity a long time ago, before many of you were born, 35 years ago, to go to the States and work in a software startup. And what I was doing is I was continuing my operating system and distributed experience, building a Unix clone called Coherent. And if you do a little bit of web browsing, you'll see that that was pretty seminal in a whole lot of ways, even though in the long term it wasn't the greatest commercial success. But for me, it was my opportunity to really tap into entrepreneurism in the US at a time when Canada was anything but, and that's really no understatement for sure. So when I decided to move on to my next thing, I had a very interesting choice. I had some very significant senior technology job offers from the Silicon Valley, but somehow I felt, I kind of wanted to play for the home team. I felt that we had such tremendous resources here in Canada, and I cast around. At the time, Ottawa was the center of the tech universe for Canada, but also I had witnessed that under the military-industrial complex of the 1970s, there were very few talented developers and programmers at the time that were actually available for startups and young companies. And so I think that really was what animated my decision to move back to Waterloo, which was kind of the seed corn, the source for all of that talent. And working for a number of years, I eventually co-founded a company where I was CEO called MKS. And that's where I really took a lot of the experience that I had gained down in the Silicon Valley and in the US, but realized that it didn't all apply one for one because the environment in Canada was different, and turned that into growing a major company. Ultimately, over the years that I was at MKS, I grew it from 0 to 50 million, about 400 employees. Our revenues were always very international. Again, I attribute that to the focus that I gained in the US, that a dollar spent on marketing south of the border probably went 10 times as far as a dollar spent on marketing north of the border. And you got to remember, in those days, a lot of the marketing was based on paper, in glossy magazines, long lead times, and so on. But I think that that lesson is still true today. When I'm advising young startups, I still say, if you have a choice between selling Shoppers Drug Mart or Walgreens or Boots, I would say go to Walgreens, same length of sale. Someone outside of Canada is going to heard of that company, unlike Shoppers Drug Mart, which is only known here regionally, so from a referenceability point of view, that's good. And lastly, if there's a reason why it's hard for you to sell in the US, then as an investor, I kind of want to know that now, because maybe you're just a regional play and not a global company. And I believe that technology companies, at their essence, are global companies because the world truly is flat.
Could you comment on maybe trying to bring this international perspective back to Canada and the political climate at the time? Well,
there's quite a lot of dimensions to the political climate of the time, because when I was moving back in the early to mid 1980s, you have to cast your mind back. That's before free trade. We were a branch plant economy, so the most desirable jobs, I think, for people were either government, big bank, or like General Motors or the branch of some big multinational firm. Now the implication of that is that not a lot of those jobs had research and development in the knowledge industries. They weren't sort of the main decision makers. Being the country manager of a country is a very different skill set than building a business from scratch. So the skills and the whole system that we had developed in Canada were quite different. I guess the most entrepreneurial of the economy was probably based in family businesses, which were more typically manufacturing, retail, and things like that. But as people that know family businesses, that ethos is almost antithetical, or the opposite of the ethos that builds the startups of today. So the skill sets we had in Canada needed to be completely reshaped. So it was partly political, and it was just partly the environment that we've had. And so I've really been quite heartened to see in Canada that we have grown infinitely more entrepreneurial. You could argue, are we yet as entrepreneurial as the US or another country? But we have taken a quantum leap in all of that. We have developed skills for people to become entrepreneurs, to build startups, and to grow businesses. But, you know, even today, I think we still have gaps. I would say one of the biggest differences between over 30 years ago and today is that there was essentially very little support, if any, for startups. And in fact, if there was advice or support, it was probably the wrong advice. It would say, start locally and then go to your region and then go to your province. They would not have said what I just said about, you know, going global early, which is the case for startups. And so, again, the environment today where there is so much support is actually quite phenomenal. I think one thing that is the same between then and now is that the capital available for startups in Canada then was pretty thin. And I discovered that because when I was planning to start MKS, my first reaction was, let's go get venture capital and build a business like I'd seen in the Silicon Valley. Well, guess what? 30 years ago, there was no venture capital. Well, for a lot of entrepreneurs today, that situation isn't a lot different. Capital still remains a challenge, although, you know, people are actually quite creative at how they can fund amazing things on very little dollars.
Those are a lot of interesting points. One thing I'd like to delve a little deeper on is, how did you break the culture of working for a company till the end of retiring and seduce these people to come embrace this entrepreneurial dream and vision that you had?
In terms of entrepreneurism too, I think that when people are recruiting and so on, that we have actually seen a big shift. I know that when MKS first entered the UK, what I found was interesting was I found anything but entrepreneurism, and UK has changed. Like, it's a big startup cluster now, especially out of London and Shoreditch and all of that in the Silicon Roundabout. But at the time, I remember hiring people and they all wanted their company cars and they wanted petrol receipts and so on. It was really a culture where they wanted to be looked after, kind of what you talked about, wanting pensions and so on. But, you know, it's also interesting, amongst the very talented people I graduated with, some of the most talented at the time actually went out and said, oh, I want to work for a big company, I want to have the pension, I want to have the security. You know what's ironic about that? Myself, who took, you know, kind of that unplanned path where I sort of, you know, created a career path just by going as I went and wasn't too worried about anything like job security or anything like that. I probably had greater job security than the people that actually went into the big corporations, because the changes in the economy, in free trade, moving to the digital economy, a lot of the market disruptions meant that a lot of those big companies laid off people. It was a whipsaw for them. So a lot of the non-entrepreneurial people took a lot greater heat than the others. And actually what that did was that forced some of those people to become more entrepreneurial. They kind of realized they had to make different choices in life. So for the youth today, the notion that you would actually go out and get a job for 30 or 35 years till you got your pension topped up is unheard of. In fact, now you see people that will work in a job 6 months or a year and consider that a normal career path. Career change is the new reality. And that is a core tenet of what it means to be more entrepreneurial and a more flexible, nimble economy.
Excellent. Now, you were able to scale your business from quite a small number, a startup, to a significantly large business. Could you comment on how you were able to maintain like a culture of innovativeness through either R&D, good hiring practices, training, while scaling, as well as being able to respond responsibly to an increasingly competitive marketplace? Like NAFTA came in, changed everything. Arguably coming down the pike now, we have things like the TPP.
I think that for MKS, one of the things that may or may not have been the model today is MKS actually layered over its life 3 different product lines over top. So it actually was a multi-product company. And what happened is the older products cross-subsidized the newer ones in a large way. We still took external capital at some point in our evolution. But so MKS always had higher growth products and slower growth products as it was able to go forward. And that diversity is not something that most startups aspire to today. I think because the capital markets for small companies are more comfortable with keep it simple and what they call the pure play. But that notion wasn't even around then, so we didn't even know that was good or bad. But it worked out pretty well for us at the time, because we were able to have our best products growing 80 to 100% year over year, which is probably, in my view, about the speed limit on growth rate. In terms of scaling and innovation, I would say the two drivers of that, which I hope that we'll see more companies in Canada learn this scaling game, because it feels like with so much attention on startups, there's not enough of those startups are scaling into what I call real businesses. I would say two drivers for that. The first you mentioned was product innovation. We were always innovating. In fact, we would have contests, a bit like Google before they did it, to ask the employees to come up with product ideas, and we would have like a group of people who would go over them, and actually that happened several times where new products or add-on product directions came from employees. So it wasn't just out there coding and investing in R&D and doing software development, but it was actually looking forward and figuring out things to do. The other thing is that we were constantly doing strategic shifts in the market, because, to be honest, as a software company, none of the rules had been set. We didn't know until a few years into it, I think, that the role of product managers. In fact, we recognized that we had to figure out a system to create product managers. Today, the software or tech company product manager is a well-defined playbook that a person can grow into. We had to build those in our early days. We also had to figure out the sales models between direct and indirect that would actually work the best for software, because that was evolving rapidly. So we actually, I guess what I could say is that the reason we kept growing and scaling is because we were continuously changing, which meant we were taking risks. Some of those things didn't work. We had a few U-turns, and in fact those are the things that hardened us and battle hardened us as entrepreneurs to be able to grow farther. If you read a book and someone tells you it's all clear sailing and there are no struggles to grow, you got to believe that those people aren't telling you the whole truth. So I think that change, struggle, and constant growth and innovation are what allows people to scale. But it's hard work. There's no question. It's something you're working 24/7 to make happen.
You always hear the words, you better have an exit strategy. From the get-go, did you have an exit strategy, or did this become more apparent over time as you got towards your own exit?
Well, Nick, your notion that you always have to have an exit strategy is something that I disagree with, perhaps almost violently. So maybe people who know me know I'm a bit of a contrarian, but if I can give you two examples of that, one from MKS. MKS was 27 years from zero to exit. We were building a great company. When we started out, we said this is so much fun. People don't even have to pay us to do this. We enjoyed what we were doing. We had a passion. Our customers were just so delighted with the products we were delivering to help their productivity. So it was really, really great. We were having a lot of fun most days doing that and growing that. So the last thing in the world we were focusing on is exit. The thing, though, that we grew up to partway through was the notion of having value, of taking external investment. That's not something that most of the early software companies got. And in fact, people in Waterloo kind of got that in the mid-90s after Wacom got sold to PowerSoft for $65 million, which back then was a huge amount of money. But before that, people were just focused on growing businesses. They weren't focused on finance. They weren't focused on exit. Fast forward to 2015, as an investor, I think I've kept some of that DNA. I actually believe that people should build businesses. And if one of the startups I was investing in, we came and said, well, I could sell it today for $5 million, and they might think, well, that's a lot of money. I would say, well, that's a consolation prize. I'm not very happy. I'm certainly one to say, double down, let's build. Unless the company's truly in trouble and needs to liquidate itself. The reason why that's important is for Canada, if we want to create jobs and build wealth and build our future economy, you build them here. If you exit early and have an exit strategy and that's all you're focused on, then almost certainly you're giving most of the value, most of the economic prosperity and the jobs to someone else. And since most of those acquirers are American, we're actually shipping our prosperity that we're developing here south of the border. And going back to the the federal and provincial government support for the startup ecosystem, that's a bad deal for our taxpayer dollars as well. However, if we're building long-term wealth and prosperity, that's a good thing. So if we look at MKS, MKS remains in Waterloo, even though it was acquired by an American company, as a vital, growing company that's creating jobs. It may not be quite as visible as part of another company, but that wealth and jobs stayed here. And I think that's so critical. So as you can see, I have maybe a different view than a lot of people on exit strategy.
Well, and I think that perspective is really good because, like you said, if you sell it too early, we don't get the chance to build then a more robust ecosystem.
Exactly. And I hate to say it, but to some extent, for a while I was seeing that scaling businesses was starting to be a lost art. And people were doing these quick flips, selling their company a year or two in, and it's kind of missing the point. And what I was most concerned about is not that individuals did that, but that was becoming the, in all these accelerators, people talk to each other, that was becoming sort of the chatter in the accelerator ecosystem, because it's the wrong chatter in my view, very, very wrong.
If you could condense down the 3 decades of experience at MKS into like 3 or 4 points that you would tell an entrepreneur, like, listen, if you're going to build an incredible company, what would they be?
Well, condensing down my time at MKS, which was actually 17 years of the 27, I would say, number one, build a great team. If you're an entrepreneur, don't try to be a single, all singing, all dancing, control freak, running everything entrepreneur. You need 2 or 3 good people or more. That's what makes a team, and it's really hard to build a founding team for a company and to get that right. So 95% of your success is going to be about the people, because A players are going to be self-aware, they're going to learn, they're going to actually be able to change and grow the business. No individual or group of individuals knows everything, so that adaptability that's baked in is really, really important. Number 2, advice and mentorship. However that is manifest, whether as an advisory board, personal mentors, board seats that come as part of, say, angel investment. That is really, really critical, because you don't know everything, and also if you're stuck in a business day to day, you sometimes just need somebody that's been there, done that, to sort of pull your head out of the sand and get you up to look at the bigger picture. Number 3, I would very strongly say that key to success is focus on being global, being big, being a leader in what you do. Have big aspirations and take it global. Don't think too small. So thinking big is important, but also think big with a certain sense of realism. So it's not just smoke and mirrors. Think big and make sure that you build the strategic underpinnings for make that happen overall. And I think the last thing is, in this day and age, even in the day of the lean startup, you're probably going to take more money than you expect if you're really growing a big business. I think you need to have a lot of focus on how you're going to raise the right kind of capital over time. That's always a shifting field. I believe it's always more difficult in Canada, although there are also advantages to building a company in Canada, so it's worth that extra fight. So I guess those would be my things, the people, think big, raising capital, and advice and mentorship would be the 4 that I would focus on.
Thank you for those 3 practical takeaways. And for those of you who don't know, Randall has had the privilege of being both an entrepreneur and a seasoned angel investor. And could you comment on how you moved into that space from an entrepreneur? Because not many people make that transition.
Well, I founded a firm in 2001 called Verdexus, which is the firm that I have with a few partners who are all serial entrepreneurs like myself. The thinking was really quite simple. I was old enough at that point, I was in my 40s, and I felt that I actually would make sense to be working with a set of companies rather than sort of going all in a single company, taking that experience and giving back. In those days, my head was more rooted in the venture capital model, and actually at Verdexus, we had actually looked at raising a fund. We talked to a number of fund of funds in Switzerland, in Germany, in New York, and but we got some very good advice. It was probably a bad time in 01, 02 to raise a fund after the tech meltdown. And also the comment was, we really like your model, this activist hands-on model where you go in and bring your experience to help businesses grow alongside money, but you're going to need to change your team and have some money people, some finance people there as well. So what that really morphed into is, for a while we worked alongside a number of venture capitalists, and we provided that activist role as we built out a portfolio, but really we put our own capital in. So I like to say, instead of having limited partners of pension funds or insurance companies, we were our own limited partners. And so that actually gave us the freedom to not be restricted to a tight asset class and perhaps do special situation transactions that we might not have been able to do if we had been a venture capital fund. So fast forward through 2002 to 2008, what I observed is, particularly in Canada, the venture capital ecosystem had been dying a slow death, with the credit crunch being the final nail in the coffin. Recognized we needed to have other forms. So that's really what caused me to get more involved in the angel ecosystem, because like in Star Wars, I mean, it's Obi-Wan Kenobi, our only hope. I don't think there were a lot of other choices for capital. And it just so happened that angel investing had been growing worldwide, in the US especially, so it was actually a very good time to get involved. So I spent quite a bit of time helping to build up the angel ecosystem, particularly through GTAN, the Golden Triangle Angel Net, which is our local angel group, to the extent that it became in the top 2 active angel groups in the country, 65 transactions into about 60 companies done in the last 6 years. And while angel investing can be, especially to companies and angels, very complicated, because it is a lot of herding cats and moving things around, the skills and values of the right angels connected with the money coming into key companies has been really, really critical. So it's, I think it's a really fabulous thing. And to be honest, in the US, 7 times as many companies get angel financed as get venture capital. And more angel money now is going in the US than in Canada. It's reversed in Canada, but I think we're still in a maturity curve. I think we're still growing into the levels of angel involvement in the US. So I say watch this space over the next few years. It's going to get even more intense.
Other than size of investment between Canada and the US, could you tell the viewers a little bit more about how angel investment in Canada may differ between countries, and like when is a good time and a bad time for startups to come out and try to get funding from angels?
Well, with angel investing, the difference in Canada and the US is, I would say, in the US, particularly in New York and on the West Coast, the valuations are higher. And that's a very simple choice for companies. If they want to move themselves to the Valley and get financed at a Valley valuation, they can do that. If companies want to get financed here, they're part of the ecosystem here. So valuations are different, amounts of capital raised are different. Having said that, one of the things it does for companies that having less capital is it makes them lean and nimble. So they have to figure out how to do more for less. And so that's always been a Canadian trait in technology, even 30 years ago. So I mean, I don't think that's really changed. So for those who feel hard done by, I think it's probably always going to be the case. So we're going to have to be a little smarter and a little more creative at how we use slightly less capital to do amazing things. So what's happened, in my experience, the focus of angels has been on sort of delaying the A round in what didn't used to be, but is now called the seed round. And I find the name funny because seed rounds now can be $1 million or $2 million. That's way more than seed used to be. Seed used to be $50,000. The angels have been involved in seed rounds that have grown and really pushed and delayed the A round. So in some cases, angels have actually replaced venture capitalists. In some cases, they've been an on-ramp for venture capital. And every company situation is different.
Excellent. And you were touching on a lot of things I was going to ask you, so that was a great answer. How do you and your partners value companies within Verdexus? Are there certain things you place more value on, such as product, team? Would you care to walk us through that a little bit?
Well, valuation, the earlier in the company, it's a bit of a black art. And to be honest, the people that think they've turned it into a science, I think, are mostly deluding themselves. So I have a sort of a principle that I use on valuation, and that is the bend over rule. So I mean, both people sort of in a negotiation bend over, and the one that feels the most, if one feels more abused than the other, then that's probably not a good valuation. But if both parties, like the founders and the investors, feel kind of equally beat up, then that's probably kind of getting in the zone of what a valuation. And although that sounds facetious, that's probably about right. And there are some norms that have evolved over the years, but again, they depend on the individual companies. I think that for founders, getting too high a valuation early can be a problem because it may necessitate a down round, which is a horrible thing to have happen. So it may make future financing harder. So as much as they say, oh, I got this great high valuation, that can actually be a problem too. And likewise, if say angels are coming in and they would take too much in the first round, then the effect of that can be that long term, the founders no longer feel the incentive that they really are driving the ship and own the business, because the recognition is there's probably going to be later rounds. So I think it's not a case about founders controlling the business, but it's the notion of the founders after the round still feeling like they get a big win if they make this business big, right? So that's just a motivation factor. And ultimately, from my perspective, the number one thing I look at is the people driving the deal, and I invest about 95% around the right people, because I think if I look at it quite simply, the right people, even with the slightly wrong business, they'll make it right. The perfect business, perfect disruptive technology idea, but with the wrong people, it'll never get anywhere. Because one of the things is, we're betting on the jockeys. You don't want to change the horses in the middle of the race. We've actually gone through a situation of changing a CEO in one of our companies, but that was actually initiated by the founder wanting to change. And it's not something we would enter planning to want to do. So we like to be founder friendly in that sense. We're tough on founders, but we think that we really are investing in a founder team.
So my question for you in Verdexus is, let's say the Wunderkinder comes in to pitch to you. What is the secret sauce? What are they pitching to you? It just blows you away. Like, this is the market right now, or?
Well, we have our market segment, and in fact, if it's too sexy, it's probably not for us, because we're focused on B2B software-based businesses. We're not doing consumer devices, nanotechnology, life sciences, particle accelerators. We're not doing any of that stuff at all. We're not doing digital media. So many times the value that's inherent in the business that's being unlocked is hidden. It's something that the average person doesn't even see. So it can actually be quite non-sexy, quite non-obvious at the beginning. So a lot of times it's the founder's unique insight into a particular market or a particular area to do something in business hasn't been done before that needs to be fixed that really excites us. So we don't necessarily get excited about the latest consumer fad. To be honest, those startups tend to get oversubscribed. There's too many of them. And in fact, if the startup's really easy to understand at that level, that's probably not for us. And again, maybe we're a little bit of a contrarian, but that kind of reflects our background as well as all B2B software people.
Other than notoriety, are there any major deal breakers for you during an evaluation in particular due diligence process for a startup?
I think a message for the founder is that even from due diligence starts on the first meeting. It starts, if they're going to pitch an angel group, when you go to the selection or screening committee, it starts literally from the first interactions, because people are assessing how do people interact as people. Specifically for Verdexus, our model is very activist and hands-on, so we put an even higher value on that coachability to be able to work with them than maybe other firms do. So we learn that, and many times we go to a term sheet fairly early, but because sometimes the term sheet draws out reactions, because you start to talk money rather than principles and so on. It draws out reactions from the founders that were unexpected. So I think if there is going to be an issue, we want to know that as quickly as possible. I mean, sure, there's the due diligence where you look, is the company incorporated and all of that stuff, and how are the financials, but to some extent that's a checkbox. What we're really interested in the people, what they're planning to do, and what are we really investing in? Where's this money going to do? What is the business plan? So, and we do try to know the market. So I guess what I would say is the deal breakers are usually naivete or inexperience, or maybe social faux pas sometimes on the parts of founders. I think a lot of times founders don't realize that how you behave is how you're perceived, right? It's an interesting thing. And perhaps it's part of being younger too, and it's something that has to be learned. But that's kind of the way I would look at it. Speaking
of perspectives, how has the fact that you and your partners being entrepreneurs influenced and given you an advantage as investors, as well as have there been any limitations by adopting certain mindsets from previous lives going forward as investors?
I think that because I've been on the other side of the table, I've been raising money, I've been pitching to investors, and I have some sympathy and empathy for the people sitting on the other side, and it's tough to pitch. So it's not that that I'm cruel and heartless about it, but I also try to explain that, but I actually do see the other side of the table. But I think a lot of times entrepreneurs don't have that empathy to say, what does an investor look at? Because to an entrepreneur, everything is possible in the world. To an investor, usually they look at it through a more risk-modulated lens. What are the risks that I'm taking with this? Whereas for an entrepreneur, a risk is something just to be swatted down or ignored. To an investor, a risk is something that's got to have a real risk mitigation plan and so on. So that risk lens, I think, is what differentiates entrepreneurs from founders or management, or from investors. So the other side is, yes, I would agree with you. If I were applying the playbooks from the 1980s or the 1990s to 2015, that would be a stupid thing. I have actually seen successful business people who think, let's just reconstitute the business I had before and do it again. But I am always out there on the latest model. I'm probably the first to use new technologies and so on. So it's very much what I do, is to try and be at the head of the curve on this stuff. And it's critical. So the day that I stop learning and reinventing myself is the day I should probably stop investing. I think it's as simple as that.
How do you balance, I'm going to use learning in its most general sense with such a high, intense, and demanding lifestyle in terms of investing. You're traveling around the world, but you're catching up on obviously current thought leadership. How do you balance all of that?
I think one of the things about running MKS, which grew into a public company and was very transactional, is I learned how to handle a lot of inputs efficiently. I guess you could call it time management, but I do manage to handle a lot of inputs. And a lot of the global travel, I think, is part of the unique value that myself and Verdexus brings, because we actually know what's going on, not just in startups in Waterloo or the Silicon Valley, but we know what's going on in Latin America, in Poland, UK, Germany, and increasingly in China, because the world is a single place. So just because someone's got the greatest idea in the world in Waterloo or in Toronto or Vancouver doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't someone else out there trying to do it. And so what's going on in the world has a huge impact on what's going on here at home. And so that's part of what we bring to the table. I think I wouldn't be who I was if I hadn't executed on a global basis, if I had sort of never left Waterloo. In fact, I'm hardly ever in Waterloo because I'm a citizen of the world, and so I try to make that work for me very well.
Thank you for making time in Waterloo today, obviously. You mentioned that you stay away from crowded markets and crowded ideas. Are there particular saturated markets these days that you would stay away from?
Well, are there saturated markets? I think there are a lot, and to some extent, I suppose I could even go into what looks like a crowded market and see a unique spin on it with the right people, and I might go for it. So again, I don't make binary black and white choices, but I would say that social networks, all of that stuff, even the potentially the whole notion of crowdsourcing and the sharing economy, multi-sided markets, a lot of those things that sounded like really good ideas, I'm not sure they're the right things, at least for me, to invest in. I think they tend to be fairly crowded overall. But I think at the same time it's possible to differentiate in a crowded market. One of our startups is actually one of the first to do multi-tenant cloud in a business-to-business space. And what's interesting is that space has been slower to get to the cloud just because that's the dynamics of that market. And so they are in a crowded market, but all of their companies are playing the old game. So they're the first to get to the new. So while it's crowded, they're differentiated. So I actually think that's quite good.
Well, thank you for your time today, Randall. I really appreciate you making time for your busy schedule.